the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Mathieu, I'm Kailey Leinz.
The House of Representatives voting on a Republican spending plan to keep the government from shutting down the end of this week. But what does it mean for Speaker Mike Johnson if the bill gets more support from Democrats than from his own Republican conference?
Plus, we'll get the view from the Senate, the latest with Virginia Democrat Mark Warner coming up.
And the leaders of the world's two largest economies arriving in San Francisco tonight. President Biden and China's Xi Jinping gearing up to meet on the sidelines of the APEC summit in California. All that still ahead this hour. Kailey, it's a big day here in Washington with some 60,000 people protesting a pro-Israel rally on the National Mall, on the steps of the Capitol, shutting down half of the city as the president heads abroad, or I should say across the country, to meet with President Xi. And some questions about what's about to happen as we start today with the continuing resolution that may keep our government from shutting down.
Yeah, we're all anxiously awaiting now the vote on the House floor. Right now, they're voting on amendments to one of the appropriation bills, but we are expecting this continuing resolution to be brought to a vote potentially within the hour, Joe. And the latest comes from Democratic leadership, Hakeem Jeffries and co, suggesting they will be supporting this measure. And we know it's going to take the Democrats to carry this thing over the finish line. 290, that's the magic number.
Well, you know, if you're with us typically on Balance of Power, we're no stranger to breaking news here. It looks like we're going to do this all over again. So joining us around the table to be a part of this, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson and Gregory Cordy. It's great to see you both here. Welcome to Balance of Power. Gregory, what's about to happen? It looks like Speaker Johnson has the votes. How many Democrats does he need to push this over the line? Do we know?
Well, he's going to lose a considerable number of Republicans on his right flank, so he needs as many Democrats as he can get. But he will need some Republicans as well, and that's just the math. He's able to do this under a suspension of the rules. That this avoids the messy fight that we would have had at the Rules Committee and really a trench warfare to try to get every last vote. It's Democrats coming to the rescue once again, and not too long ago we were here talking about that Hastert rule, right? Where it's bad politics for Republicans to have to rely on Democrats to govern, because remember, that was the whole issue that got the former Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, deposed in the first place, was passing one of these short-lived CRs with the help of Democrats.
How glad I am that you brought that up, Gregory. This has been my question all day. This feels like deja vu, a clean continuing resolution that not only is going to be passed with Democratic support, but doesn't cut spending, which is what so many members, conservative members especially, of the Republican conference want to see. But Mike Johnson's just going to be able to keep the gavel, no problem. That was a Kevin McCarthy specific issue, Wendy?
Right, but it seems Gregory is absolutely right, but it seems like this is almost like Muhammad Ali exhausting his opponents. The House Freedom Caucus is a hard no on this bill, but it's not a revolutionary no. I mean, they're just sort of exhausted. They don't want to go through another speaker fight. They know that's a bad idea, and so they will perhaps accept this and live to fight another day in January or February against it. But you're absolutely right. The House Democrats have come out in favor of this. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Democratic leader, has made noises suggesting he will be in favor of it. Biden's backed off his veto threat. So it looks like everything's going to happen. And Mike Johnson and the Republicans could market this as, hey, we worked with the other party and we got something done, which I think actually might be a welcome message to voters.
It's amazing how the pieces fall together so quickly. Let's hear from the Democratic leader in the Senate, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, today.
I'm heartened, very cautiously so, that Speaker Johnson is moving forward with a CR that precisely omits the sort of hard right cuts that would have been non-starters for Democrats.
So what's going to happen next? Is the Senate basically going to rubber stamp this thing, and what you get today in the House is what will be the continuing resolution, or will there be some conferencing of the two different versions?
I feel like the key element in all of this was what didn't happen yesterday, when President Biden did not come out with a veto threat of this House Republican plan. It sent the signal pretty clearly to Democrats in the House, but also in the Senate, that this is something the White House can live with. It does not deliver on the key priorities of President Biden to fund Ukraine, to fund Israel, and he threw in funding security at the southern border as a deal sweetener, but it also doesn't have any cuts, and it doesn't have any policy writers that the White House would object to over abortion or whatever other issue. And it gets us into the new year. It gets us into January, February, after the holidays, where we can take up this fight again.
So, of course, President Biden does have his eye on these domestic issues when it comes to funding, Gregory. But also this week, he is very focused on geopolitics, as he is right now en route to tomorrow meet with President of China, Xi Jinping, in San Francisco on the sidelines of the APEC meeting. And actually, before departing, he outlined what his goal is with this meeting. Take a listen.
To get back on a normal course of corresponding, being able to pick up the phone and talk to one another if there's a crisis, being able to make sure our military still have contact with one another.
How high of a bar is that, Wendy? What tangibly can we actually expect out of this meeting?
Well, that would normally be a pretty low bar, but I'd call it a medium bar with an adversary like Xi Jinping is right now. I mean, it looks like he is going to get one tangible thing from this, which is the deal for China an agreement that China will crack down harder on the chemical companies that make the ingredients for fentanyl and then sell them to the Mexican drug cartels, which then bring it to the United States. That could be a real win for Democrats if, again, they convince voters that they are the ones reducing fentanyl, which is a drug that affects more of a Republican base voter, white, uncollege-educated voters. And the Republicans have been making a lot of hay about fentanyl and opioid crisis, and the Democrats need to really market on that. So that's one. The other is just they're talking. It's always better if two leaders talk then don't talk. So I think, as the president said, being able to pick up the phone and call him and say, there's something going on we need to talk about would be good, unless, because it's an election year, he's tagged with being soft on China.
But also reestablishing military-to-military communications.
Yes.
We really should underscore the importance of that with the number of close calls that we've seen in the South China Sea. Right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I believe Biden is going to bring up is to suggest to China that they not get involved in Taiwan's elections this year, nor ours, that they just need to stay out of elections that aren't theirs.
Sounds like there could be some pretty important messaging here. We'll see what
Certainly.
The takeaways are.
One thing we know the president is going to try very hard to message, though, is that he is not seeking to decouple from China. This is something we have heard reiterated by the administration time and again, and of course something that many have warned would have pretty significant economic consequences, potentially could be inflationary, for example. And Gregory, we know that is something this administration is fighting very hard. We did get some good news on that front. CPI data today coming in cooler than expected, and President Biden very quick to flex this. He says inflation is now down 65% from the peak. He goes on to point out how this happens as the unemployment rate has remained very low. And in his statement, he says, I'm working to get results for the American people, and it's happening. But Gregory, the fact remains, they aren't giving him credit for it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to deny that these numbers are good economic numbers for the president. The problem is there's always that gap between perception and reality. The numbers, the economic indicators that we live and die by here versus what people are feeling. And what people are feeling is still the cumulative of inflation, not just voters don't look at inflation as a month-over-month measure or even year-over-year. They're comparing it to what their life was before the pandemic, right? And so even though we've had a little bit of disinflation, we haven't had deflation. The prices aren't ever going down anytime soon. And so it's still elevated, and there's a lot of sort of economic security out there. We're seeing it in the polling. And the challenge for the president over the next year is to convince people that this is real, that we have turned a corner, and the economy is getting better and more hopeful.
So when does the sales pitch really begin from the Biden campaign then? I don't know if we can see that,
Great question.
That quote again, but what if that was a billboard in every town and city in the country? Inflation is down 65% from the peak. I'm not kidding, actually. That's something that he needs to sell between now and then. How does he get it across?
He does need to sell it, but just as Gregory said, if you're going to the grocery store and butter is still $6 a pound, and basic prices are still higher than you're used to them being, it doesn't matter if he says inflation is down 100%. It's what comes out of your wallet, what comes out of your thing. But when they should start messaging? Yesterday. I mean, our Bloomberg Morning Consult poll shows that swing state voters, the ones who will decide the election, are very worried about the economy. So something is going on in the messaging from the White House and the re-election campaign that is not getting through.
You're going to get a mission accomplished banner at some point in this campaign? I'm not kidding.
He could use one.
Well, I mean, at some point he's going to try to declare victory here, I presume.
That didn't work that well for Georgia.
Well, no, it did not.
Right, and especially in regard to inflation, knowing how the whole transitory thing went, I think declaring victory early is something a lot of people are going to try to avoid. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson and Gregory Cordy, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. Now, coming back, we're going to turn back to Capitol Hill and the progress, perhaps, to avert a looming government shutdown. We'll have more on the vote that's about to happen and what could come next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
We have a $33.6 trillion federal debt. Moody's downgraded our credit rating just this week. 2 weeks ago, the Treasury Department announced we have to borrow $1.5 trillion over the next 2 quarters to keep the government going. We cannot do that anymore. And so the latter CR, the two-step CR, everybody calls it something different. It's a new innovation. But it's going to change the way we've done this.
That was Speaker of the House Mike Johnson earlier. With federal government funding running out just a few days from now, he's trying this evening to avert that potential shutdown. A vote expected on the floor anytime now. For more, let's bring in Rohit Kumar, PwC Washington National Tax Services Principal and former Domestic Policy Director and Deputy Chief of Staff to Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. Thank you so much, Rohit, for joining us here in studio. We just heard the speaker there talking about how this is a two-step CR. Essentially, we're looking at new deadlines, January 19th and February 2nd. Should we be considering, assuming this passes in the Senate, gets the requisite signature from Biden, that this is a shutdown avoided or just a shutdown deferred to January 19th?
Well, it's certainly a shutdown avoided before the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, so that's what passes for a victory right now. It doesn't resolve any of the underlying issues. The House and the Senate are still $100 billion apart from each other in terms of how much we should spend in the discretionary accounts over the upcoming fiscal year. It creates 2 deadlines. It's not clear to me that this is going to materially change the result in terms of the final result. Look, the final result, at the end of the day, given the orientation of government we have, is whatever can get at least 218 votes in the House, not 218 Republican votes in the House, but 218 total votes in the House. 60 votes in a Senate that is controlled by Senate Democrats and signed by a president who himself is a Democrat. So the final answer is going to be something bipartisan. We've just delayed that day of reckoning, but at some point we're going to have to sign a bill into law that doesn't get the Freedom Caucus Republicans, doesn't get the most progressive Democrats, but gets somewhere between 218 or north of 218 from the middle of the House and gets 60 from the middle of the Senate. And so I think the Speaker has bought himself some time. Right, and it's interesting that this is a clean CR. There is no spending cuts here, as the prior panel was talking. No spending cuts, no policy riders. It's got 2 deadlines instead of 1 deadline, but it's not really materially different than what former Speaker McCarthy had proposed, and that caused him to lose his job. So, look, the new Speaker is clearly getting some grace, a little bit more of a honeymoon out of his conference than the prior Speaker did. We'll see how long it lasts.
When you hear this Speaker talk, you'd think that this idea of the laddered CR has somehow reinvented the budgeting process. Can you explain to me, we'll just get to the dumb question, what is the point of this? Where is the advantage? What is he gaining by doing this?
You know, I think it's just that it's different. Right, there's a significant.
We must be really bored at this point.
There's a significant instinct against just doing what we've always done. Right, we have a deadline around December 15th that yields a Christmas omnibus. The House feels aggrieved by that, so this takes us out of the holiday season, sets up 1 deadline instead of 2. That's different than having 1 deadline. So that's Is
the idea that it might start negotiations earlier than just having one deadline?
What it does do is, because it's now a January 19th and then February 2nd deadline, it does give the House a little bit more time to try to pass all of the bills individually. They've passed 7. The last 5 are proving more troublesome. It's not automatic, that just because you have till January that the other 5 are going to get any easier, but I think it's going to give them a chance to try. And look, there is a thing, and I experienced this when I worked in Republican leader's office for Senator McConnell and others. Winning begets winning. This feels like a little bit of a win, right? And it feels good to win. It feels much better to win than it does to lose. And so you inspire a little bit of team ball amongst your conference. Maybe you get a little bit more cooperation. You can take a small victory and build it into medium and larger victories. And then at the end of it, yes, you're going to have some bipartisan compromise. Yes, some Republicans are going to vote no on the final bill. But, you get some sort of team mentality going. And that has been sorely lacking amongst the House Republican Conference, as we saw for the last month as they were going through this replacing the speaker exercise.
You speak of a victory that could be large. One thing that we know is very large is the size of the U.S. deficit. And really that's what the heart of a lot of these funding conversations comes down to, as to how exactly this needs to be addressed. This was something that the CEO of Citadel, Ken Griffin, spoke exclusively with Bloomberg about earlier today at the Citadel Securities Global Macro Conference in Miami. This is what he said to about fiscal policy. Just take a listen.
We think next year fiscal policy will not tighten that much. We're heading into a presidential election. It's really hard for politicians on either side of the aisle to do what we need to do, which is to rein in our deficit spending.
So I guess there's 2 questions for you, Rohit. How do you do it? And is there any political willpower to do it?
Look, right now, there's limited political willpower to do it. Look, this fight is about the discretionary part of the budget. That's about 30% of what the federal government spends in any given year. The other 70%, the vast majority of federal spending is mandatory spending, entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right? The programs that nobody is talking about touching. We are not talking about entitlement reform. We're talking about less than 1/3 of the federal budget. The real problem is being driven by the entitlement programs that are kind of on automatic spend. I agree. We're probably not going to see a lot of fiscal tightening. We're not going to do meaningful entitlement reform in an election year, right? There's sort of no sign of meaningful entitlement reform anywhere on the horizon. We're a presidential campaign, the last presidential campaign, both candidates were talking about not touching Social Security, not touching entitlements whatsoever. So we are not yet at a point where the political stars have aligned to have a serious conversation about the big drivers of our deficits and our debts. So we're having these episodic other conversations about at most 1/3, but really less than 1/3 of what we spend on an annual basis.
I have to ask you about Ukraine while you're here, because you were so close to Leader McConnell for so long, and this is a big priority for him that is not shared by all Republicans. It's looking like if it's not attached here to the continuing resolution, this might have to take a longer wait. Could we be looking at next year for this to be taken up? And what kind of a rebranding does he need to consider to get this passed?
Well, look, he's made it pretty clear that if there's going to be a national security supplemental to include Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, it also has to have something on border. And I think that's the key.
The House wants to slice it up, though.
Yeah, the House sent over a bill that was just Israel, and it was paid for, although the numbers didn't actually end up bearing out, with some reduction in IRS funding. Look, at the end of the day, I don't think the National Security Supplemental, in whatever form, is going to end up having offsets. We don't typically offset it. Now, again, you might say that's how we get to a deficit and a debt as big as it is, but again, it's not the discretionary spending that's driving it. It's the other part of the equation. I think the Israel, Ukraine, sort of Taiwan border piece, those 4 components, those will still get an airing in December, and more work has to be done. It's being mostly done in the Senate right now around the border security piece. But if they can stick the landing, and that's not easy to do, right? The border and immigration politics are as tricky as any in the country. But if they can work something out on the border, then they, I think, have the opportunity to unlock the rest of that through the national security piece. There's also a pretty important tax piece that's sitting around that thought it might ride on a government funding bill. That's clearly not going to happen. So that's another thing that I think sort of needs to happen before the end of the calendar year. And I don't think those 2 things happen together, but I sort of think of the rest of the year as having 2 kind of major undone items: the national security funding piece and a tax piece that the tax writers are getting pretty close on. But then they need to find a home for it, either as a freestanding bill or as attached to something else, and get that across the finish line.
This is the real stuff. It's always great to walk through the process with you. Don't be a stranger while we're trying to feel our way through this. Many thanks to Rohit Kumar, former Domestic Policy Director, Deputy Chief of Staff to Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. Coming up on Balance of Power, President Biden traveling to San Francisco with U.S.-China relations in the spotlight.
Really important that we try to find common ground to build a better relationship with China on. rather than continuing this downward spiral of tit for tat on trade policies and otherwise. Our economies are incredibly coupled together, and an abrupt decoupling would come at just catastrophic costs to the people.
We're not trying to decouple from China, but what we're trying to do is change the relationship for the better. From my perspective, if in fact the Chinese people who are in trouble right now economically, if the average if the average citizen in China was able to have a decent paying job, that benefits them and it benefits all of us.
President Biden speaking earlier today before heading to San Francisco for a high-stakes meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping tomorrow, which we'll be talking a lot more about then. Here with more on what we can expect, though, is Gerard DePippo, Bloomberg Economics Senior Geo-Economics Analyst. Gerard, it's great to see you. I still think you have the best title in the building. There are different expectations for this trip, for this meeting, depending on who you talk to. What does this president need to call it a win?
Which one? I think for Biden, I think modest deliverables, particularly about fentanyl or military-to-military talks, would be, not great, not huge, but something that he can tout as a win. Mm-hmm. A lot of the talks will be on foreign policy issues, things like Iran or North Korea, that is going to be less public. They'll probably press each other on Taiwan as well. But I think ultimately for President Biden, it's about delivering something. I think fentanyl will probably be that. For Xi Jinping, it's really just about the optics. It's not about specific deliverables. Mm-hmm. It's about trying to signal stability in the bilateral relationship, which would be helpful, at least marginally, for economic reasons.
Well, when we think about the economics of that, though, having just heard President Biden say that what he's seeking is not to decouple, I want to point to your Bloomberg Economics research, which you put out ahead of this meeting, and you wrote, trade, investment, and people flows between the U.S. and China have flatlined or declined markedly in recent years, adding to concerns of a gradual decoupling, despite assurances from the Biden administration that that's not their aim. So essentially, whether or not Biden says he's pushing for it, the decoupling is happening. Should we call it a decoupling?
Well, so what the U.S. government is pushing is de-risking.
Diversifying.
Decoupling is right. Yeah. And the reality is most of the economic interactions are going to be decided by private actors, including tourism and students. And so what we were observing is that actually, yes, there's a lot of robust economic linkages between the two world's largest economies, but they're sort of flatlining in nominal terms. And actually, if you're looking at things like FDI and portfolio investment, those are probably declining overall. And if you scale it relative to GDP, it's actually down quite a bit over the past decade. And so is that decoupling? Not quite, but it's definitely sort of an erosion. And I think on the people-to-people side is where you see it being much starker. So if you look at travel between the two, obviously a lot of that was because of COVID, but it's still quite slow to come back, particularly on Americans going back to China. And I think over time, those differences, the fact that there are so few American students studying in China, will sort of add to mutual suspicions and probably be less stabilizing in terms of bilateral relations.
Could there not be some light here, maybe some surprises on the business side? There's been reporting that Boeing, for instance, could unlock sales of 737 MAXs again. Would that not be exceeding expectations?
I think it would probably be meeting expectations.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
we don't know exactly. Well, so it was rumored ahead of the Raimondo visit. The Chinese did not move on that. They probably were waiting for a bigger moment, which would be now.
Been talking about it for years.
Yes, exactly. I mean, part of that was because of COVID, so demand was lower.
Right.
But now that travel's back up, there's use for those planes. Airbus can only make so many, so there is some need for that. That would be probably the business deliverable. Also, the Chinese had expedited imports of U.S. soybeans, which they kind of need anyway, but that's sort of a standard give that the Chinese offer.
Great work, great reporting. We appreciate you coming in and talk to us about it as we get set for this meeting tomorrow. Gerard DePippo, Bloomberg Economics Senior Geo-Economics Analyst, we thank you. Turning now back to Capitol Hill, with the House of Representatives, as we speak, poised to vote on a continuing resolution to keep the government open past the end of this week. That vote could begin at any moment now. And joining us to jump into the conversation is Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. Senator, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. Do you like what you're seeing here? I know that Chuck Schumer said that he was heartened by the process in the House. Will the Senate sign off if this passes?
Well, I think the process stinks. The idea that we're having two votes and we're kicking the can into January for part of the budget, February for the other part, and your viewers probably understand this better than most. I mean, that means that, let's take the Defense Department. We got a lot of ship repair in Virginia. If you finished a ship repair in September at the end of last fiscal year, and you've got an empty dry dock now, you can't start on the next project because it's still a CR. You're still operating off of last year's budget. So while the top line number may be the same, the inefficiency. Now, the process being crummy, does that mean I'm going to, vote to shut down the government over it? No, I think I got to, we got to be adults. And unlike some of the crowd in the House, and if it comes over, and as long as it's clean and there's not any other, add-ons, poison pills, funny business, I think that the overwhelming majority of us will support this. And the last thing the economy or the country, or for that matter the world, needs is the United States government to shut down, going into Thanksgiving week.
But even, Senator, if it doesn't shut down heading into Thanksgiving, are we looking at a likely shutdown come January 19th? Because you still have to reconcile appropriations bills that your chamber and the House would like to look very different.
Well, I think the staggering was a good sign. The bills that have already passed are more in that first tranche on January 19th. The DOD bill and some of the other big bills, the following 8 are in, I think, early February. There's more than enough time. Again, my hope would be the House would adhere to the deal that was cut between the Speaker and the President. And I think those top lines are where there's going to be some conversation. But even if we, go through a bit more drama, into the new year, we've got lots of things that we still need to get done by the end of the fiscal year. We've got to pass the defense bill. In that defense bill, I hope, or somewhere will be attached, is a critical component, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, a value which is called Section 702, which allows the United States government to follow conversations of foreign individuals that is extraordinarily valuable right now in terms of Ukraine, in terms of the Middle East. That expires. We've got to also, and this is as important, I think, as historic as anything, we got to make sure we deal with what the president has put forward on what's called the supplemental, which means how do we not walk away from our commitment to Ukraine at this moment in time? How do we provide assistance to Israel in the Middle East? How do we provide humanitarian aid that helps both Israel and not just folks in Gaza, but other nation states who are in a kind of a tumble now because of that challenge? And how do we make sure, your earlier comments about the president's meeting with President Xi, how do we make sure we do continue to beef up our activities in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in terms of technology competition with China? So there's a big agenda to get done.
Well, Senator, I'll tell you, it appears the House does not have a lock on the drama. I have to ask you about an exchange that took place earlier in the upper chamber that took place involving Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, the Teamsters President Sean O'Brien, and the chair of the committee, Senator Bernie Sanders. This is the Senate Health Committee we're talking about, and a fight that almost broke out today. Let's have everyone watch what I'm talking about. We'll have you respond.
Sir, this is a time, this is a place. If you want to run your mouth, we can be two consenting adults. We can finish it here.
Okay, that's fine. Perfect.
You want to do it now?
I'd love to do it right now.
Well, stand your butt up then.
You stand your butt up.
Oh, hold on.
No,
stop it.
Is that your solution every problem?
No, sit down.
No, you're a clown.
Sit down.
Okay.
You're a United States Senator.
You're an embarrassment. You're an embarrassment.
You're
an embarrassment to the state of
This hearing is about the condition of the working class in America. That's why we're talking.
You're the biggest thug here.
You brought him in.
All right,
you're the biggest thug. Even your colleagues call you.
Why you do what you're doing?
All right, so this really happened. This is not a video from Saturday Night Live. Senator, you know the individuals involved here. I'll let everyone know, by the way, Senator Mullen is a former mixed martial arts fighter. He was ready to go, Senator. Is the upper chamber becoming the House of Representatives?
I'd heard about this, and literally my staff showed it to me before I came over to this interview. If they just hadn't shown it to me, I could have said, gosh, that sounds awful, but I can't comment until I look at it. I'm like...
What went through your mind when you're watching this?
Oh, God. Oh, it's like, some people up here work hard to get that, 8 or 9% approval rating that we have, and more antics like that and that 8 or 9% approval rating of the institution writ large. It just, the country deserves better.
You know, there was a congressman today said he got punched in the back by the former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. We saw Chairman Comer's committee hearing come into some sort of conflict with a bunch of yelling. is this the future of the legislature?
I sure hope
Has anyone threatened you lately?
I do worry about the fact that when, as you guys know, I've been part of every bipartisan group of senators that have ever come together. We did the infrastructure bill. We did the CHIPS bill. We worked on the Inflation Reduction Act, the Electoral Count Act. And I do worry at times when the Joe Manchins and the Mitt Romneys leave following the Rob Portmans and the Roy Blunts and the Richard Burrs. We got to hire people that can have strong opinions but know how to get to yes. The whole notion of what the founders set up with this experiment in democracy was you got to have checks and balances. Part of that checks and balances means nobody gets to run the show, but you've got to find a way to compromise to get to yes. As you guys know, I was a business guy longer than I've been a politician. I think I can still claim that for about another year. But if all I did was run down the opposition and never put out a good product, I wouldn't be in business very long. And what I so worry about is that, you've got these kind of antics. You've got a House that went without a speaker for 3 weeks. You've got potentially the United States walking away from a solemn commitment to Ukraine that makes the whole notion of NATO be a little bit up for grabs. Who would ever trust us again? You have got literally hundreds of senior members of our military not able to get their promotion and get their families moved in because one guy takes advantage of some archaic Senate rule. We deserve better. The folks deserve better.
Well, Senator, you just said there that the U.S. may be about to walk away from Ukraine, especially considering Ukraine funding is not included in this continuing resolution. Do you think there is a real risk that just never passes both chambers?
I pray not. I think this is the part where the minority of the minority, too often up here, drives the bus. And a whole lot of Americans are saying, what the heck is happening? Why can't reasonable people in both parties get along? I mean, I still believe there's 75 votes in the Senate for aid to Ukraine. I mean, the crazy thing, I feel that Ronald Reagan must be rolling over in his grave. The Ukrainians have literally taken out 50% of Russia's military capacity without a single American soldier or NATO soldier's life being lost. If we were to walk away, we would literally undermine the word of America. It would make people question our treaty alliances. And the thing that is just makes me crazy is that some of these folks who say, I don't care about Putin and Ukraine, but I want to do all I can to make sure Iran doesn't do well or make sure that President Xi is constrained. If you don't understand that if you give a green light to an autocratic ruler like Putin, that Iran and China won't take that as a sign that they can move more aggressively, then you don't pass Geopolitics 101.
This money is clearly going to be delayed for Ukraine, Senator. As chair of the Intelligence Committee, you know more about this than most people do. How much time do they have? If there's a chance this bleeds into next year, what does it mean for Ukraine?
We have to get this done this year. It would be a historic mistake. People in jobs like mine have a tendency to overstate, and there have been, comparisons to what happened in the late 30s in terms of, post-Munich, in terms of Britain turning a blind eye to Hitler's expansion into Czechoslovakia. I'm not one for overstating, but this could be one of those historic moments. And the Europeans, both in terms of their military assistance, and frankly, they've even done more humanitarian. They've taken millions of Ukrainians in, but they need American leadership as well. We cannot fail on this task. And I'd say that, to all those who, even if they don't care about the war crimes that Vladimir Putin has committed, but they say they want to stand against Iran or stand up against the Communist Party and President Xi, you give that green card to Putin, you allow autocratic regimes elsewhere to be successful as well. So we've got to do our job.
Well, Senator, Joe just referenced the job you were doing on the Intelligence Committee, but of course that's not the only committee on which you sit. You also are a member of the Senate Banking Committee, and you had a hearing today with banking regulators, including Michael Barr, the Fed's vice chair of supervision, on a day which, mind you, the Fed's role in terms of its dual mandate when it comes to prices, they maybe got some good news on today in the form of inflation data. Is it time for the Fed to declare victory on the inflation front and just shift all of their focus to their supervisory role?
Well, I do think it's time for the Fed to at least continue the pause. I don't think, I know Jay Powell. I have a lot of respect for him. I don't think he's going to declare victory, but it was very good news for the economy. They may be able to do this soft landing, bring down high inflation without a recession. But it is one of the reasons why one of the topics that we were talking about today, and now to kind of go from the global to kind of more nerdy but important as well. The Fed has proposed something called Basel III bank capital standards, raising those bank capital standards dramatically at this moment in time, even though they're still getting input. With this high, with high interest rates already out there, with the existing tightening of monetary policy, with the, frankly, geopolitical risk out there, could actually cause a dramatic constriction in lending, and that's not what we want to have happen at this point. Now, I do acknowledge that the banks, whenever there's a new regulation, cry, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. This time, they may be right, and I'm following this very closely. I also pointed out that there is a tool that that when the Fed was first created, saying using what's called the discount window. So if you've got a liquidity problem, you can go to Fed and borrow some money that, frankly, banks have not been using fully. I want to see if we can interject that in before we perhaps layer on a lot of additional requirements.
All right, Senator, I'll just end by saying, for the record, when you're on Bloomberg, nerdy is allowed. That's kind of what we do here. So please come back anytime. We always appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, guys.
All right, Senator Mark Warner, the Democrat from Virginia, thank you very much. Now, coming up, some other Democrats in the House are backing Speaker Mike Johnson's plan to prevent a government shutdown. Seems in the Senate as well. We'll have all those details next with our political panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
A government shutdown, by Friday is admirable, but we're just setting ourselves up for a shutdown in January if, in fact, they continue down the path of not observing the deal that then Speaker McCarthy made with the president, which, we gave up $1 trillion in that deal. That was not a frivolous deal.
That was Gwen Moore, Democratic Congresswoman from Wisconsin, on Sound On earlier today. For more, let's bring in our political panel as we await a vote on this continuing resolution in the House. Kristen Hawn of Rokk Solutions is joining us, as well as Lester Munson, International BGR Government Affairs Principal. So, Kristen, we're waiting for this vote to officially start. It seems, though, if you're judging by the messaging from Democratic leadership, that Democrats are going to support this continuing resolution. Why give the win to Mike Johnson here? Are they giving up leverage?
Well, I think they want to go home for the holidays, but
it's about the turkey.
I think it's about the turkey. No, I don't think that Representative Jayapal should have come out and said this is a huge win for the Democrats.
Yes.
In the very beginning, when the speaker's trying to get his conference on board with this, but essentially, as far as continuing resolutions go, there weren't any major cuts, and I think the speaker was only able to do it because he was able to convince, his conference that you gave this to me. I think there was a football analogy in there somewhere. He gave this to me, with a minute left to go in the game, we're down by 35. You need to give me a little leeway. But I do think they're setting themselves up for not one but two government shutdown.
Well, we are just now getting into the process here. If you're watching the screen, the vote is now just beginning in the House, and it does appear that this is going to pass. Lester, I had a Republican member say to me today, this will work because more Democrats want to get home for Christmas and Thanksgiving than Republicans want to burn the place down. Does that sound about right?
I don't know if I would be quite that colorful about it. The Republicans are definitely more skeptical of this arrangement because it does keep us spending at the same rate, which is a spending rate that has a huge budget deficit associated with it. So fiscal hawks are taking a risk here. They're supporting a continuing resolution that they don't really like because they recognize that the new speaker needs some time to kind of make some arrangements to have a regular order on spending bills, if that's possible.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking here at the images from the House floor as this vote is underway. There's about 3 minutes left, and of course, we'll be bringing you the final result. But something we aren't necessarily seeing on camera that Bloomberg reporters in the chamber have said is going on in the House floor. Are people fake punching each other in the back and the kidneys? And this is related to something else that isn't really about governing and legislative matters that happened on the Hill today. Congressman Tim Burchett describing a run-in with former Speaker Kevin McCarthy in the hallway. Just take a listen to this one.
Yeah, he just elbowed me in the kidneys is all he did. You know, it was deliberate. It was just a cheap shot by a bully.
Oh, wow.
This is where we are, Lester, in this House of Representatives.
The House has always been kind of a pugilistic place, and I worked there for several years. I can remember a number of incidents where members either were kind of taking shot at each other or certainly wanted to. I'll just say I think there's a real contrast with what happened with the March for Israel in Washington today, where we saw bipartisan leadership from the House and the Senate together, standing on the same stage, Senator Schumer, the majority leader, next to Speaker Mike Johnson, for the same cause, for the same good cause, I would say, showing real unanimity. So it's not all hopeless here in the Capitol.
I'm glad you pointed that out because it was on both sides of the Capitol today. Burchett, by the way, we should be clear. Kevin McCarthy says he did not punch Tim Burchett in the kidneys. I don't know if they'll work that out together. But my goodness, you saw us talking to Senator Warner about what happened in the Health Committee today. There was almost a brawl in there between a senator and the president of the Teamsters Union. What is going on Capitol Hill?
And that was round two for the two of them in committee. I mean, I just think you don't see a lot of that coming out of the Senate. So a lot of these feelings are boiling over. And it's not just now between Democrats and Republicans on the House side. It's clearly within the Republican conference. They've gone through a really tough time and still really haven't worked themselves out of it. I think it's unfortunate that, people don't send their elected officials to get in fights in the basement hallways of the Capitol.
I didn't think so.
Yeah.
Coming up, President Biden and President Xi are expected to meet tomorrow. No fighting. Amid long, frosty U.S.-China relations, we'll keep an eye on the House floor for you and look ahead to what the president agenda looks like with our political panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is why you join us every day here on BOP. We have breaking news again now coming from the House of Representatives. Guess what? It appears much less likely the government will shut down at the end of this week. They just passed a continuing resolution. 336-95 the vote here. It took quite a big number of Democrats to get this done with, my gosh, what do we have here? More than 90 Republicans voting no, a larger number than some expected. Let's take a quick swing at this now that it's done with our political panel. Kristen Hawn of Rokk Solutions and Lester Munson, International BGR Government Affairs Principal. How's the conference going to feel about this vote?
It's a great question. This is a huge test for Speaker Johnson. He has just passed a funding bill with a majority of Democratic votes and a huge number of Republicans voting against it. Granted, a majority of Republicans did support it. But can his speakership survive this vote? I strongly suspect that it will. And I think that's a good thing for the country, that he's got that kind of political flexibility to bring things to the floor that aren't unanimously supported by his conference. This is actually a very good sign.
Well, this is a question we've been asking all day, Lester, is why is he getting grace that Kevin McCarthy was not granted? And actually, Congressman Matt Gaetz, one of the 8 who voted to oust McCarthy, was speaking with a Bloomberg reporter earlier, and he said Kevin McCarthy had 7 months. Mike Johnson didn't have that much time to figure this out, so maybe that's part of it. The fact of the matter, though, Kristen, remains that this is a clean continuing resolution. Yes, it keeps the government funding. What it does not include are things that Democrats and specifically the White House really want. Funding for Israel and Ukraine, part of this emergency request. So where do we go from here on those issues?
I mean, it's going to be difficult, and it's yet to be seen, how long this grace period lasts for the speaker. I mean, if you have a governing majority of Democrats and Republicans in the House, they can clearly get stuff done. But with, a motion to vacate the speakership, kind of set themselves up for failure. So it's going to be very difficult. We've not only got the funding issues to deal with, but like you said, Ukraine aid, Israel, and you're all looking at these very difficult decisions. So I would guess that there are going to be a lot of staff who are going to be working through the holidays to try to meet these deadlines.
Boy, a lot of staff is working overtime now for the president as he prepares for a very important meeting tomorrow in San Francisco with President Xi. Lester, you can put your Foreign Relations Committee hat back on for us for a moment here. There have been questions about what would qualify as a win. Should expectations be as low as they are? But it's been a long time since these two gentlemen were together, and even longer since President Xi left China. What are the stakes here? What would look like progress to you?
Well, I think the fact that they're sitting down and talking is a good thing. It's going to resonate for President Biden. It's he's speaking to the next most important leader in the world here in the United States, and they're going to have some kind of accomplishments from this summit. It could be better military to military contacts, things like that. Some of this work on artificial intelligence. I'm a little pessimistic that it'll actually be carried out by China, but some of that could be good for the president. I worry about some of the promises he had to make to get Xi Jinping to San Francisco and some of the concessions he may have had to offer just to have this meeting at all. And so I think that's what we're likely to see Congress push back on. Once Congress kind of sorts through this spending issue, I expect them to be pushing back on the White House on China relations. There's a little bit of an opening here for the hardliners to go after the president.
Kristen, we only have about 30 seconds, but what's at stake for Biden tomorrow?
I think there's a lot. He's shown himself to be a leader on the world stage. I think people vote for their domestic priorities. Can they put food on the table? But I think that it's a lot's at stake for his presidency and his legacy.
All right. Well, of course, we'll have full coverage of that tomorrow. But thank you both so much for joining us this evening. Kristen, Hawn, and Lester Munson, we really appreciate your time. And, of course, for more coverage on all things Washington, both domestic and geopolitics, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find that on the terminal and online.
They passed the bill. We'll see what happens tomorrow. See you then on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.